The rain fell on Chicago with the relentless, percussive rhythm of a dirge. It was a cold, unforgiving downpour for late October of 1926, washing the city's grime into the gutters and turning the cobblestones of the warehouse district into a slick, black mirror that reflected the weak glow of distant gas lamps. For Stanley, the rain was a cloak. It muffled the groan of his Ford Model T's engine, discouraged the casual patrols of inquisitive coppers, and kept decent folk locked behind their doors. It was the perfect weather for a man who dealt in shadows. He stood under the meager shelter of the loading dock's corrugated iron roof, a silhouette of a man framed against the yawning darkness of the warehouse behind him. His trench coat, a relic from a different, more official war, was damp and heavy on his shoulders, smelling of wet wool and the faint, lingering scent of motor oil. A fedora, pulled low, cast his face in permanent twilight, but even in the gloom, one could see the hard set of his jaw and the weary caution in his eyes. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much in the muddy trenches of the Marne, and had come home to find the world he'd fought for was just as treacherous, only with different uniforms. The Great War had hollowed him out, scraped away the boy he had been, and left this efficient, silent machine in his place. He moved with a purpose that bordered on mechanical, his actions economical and precise. There was no wasted motion as he supervised the final stages of the loading. Two hired men, their faces obscured by the gloom and their own desire for anonymity, heaved the last of the wooden crates onto the flatbed of the truck. The sound of splintering wood and the clinking of glass bottles within was a quiet symphony of illegality. "That's the last of it, Stan," one of the men grunted, wiping a forearm across his damp brow. Stanley didn't respond with words. He merely stepped forward, his boots making a soft, solid sound on the wet concrete. He ran a practiced hand over the stacked crates, checking their stability. Each box contained 12 bottles of the finest Canadian whiskey, liquid gold in this parched, Prohibition-era landscape. This cargo was more than just illicit booze. It was a speakeasy's lifeblood, a gangster's profit margin, and Stanley's solitary, dangerous living. He was a bootlegger, but not a thug. He was a logistician of the forbidden, a ghost on the highways, known for his reliability and his utter lack of sentiment. He worked alone, trusted no one, and made his deliveries on time. It was a simple, brutal code that had kept him alive and out of a federal prison. He tossed a few bills to the hired men, a sum that ensured their labor and their silence. They melted back into the night without another word, leaving him alone with his truck and its precious, illegal burden. He moved around the vehicle, his inspection methodical. He checked the tires, the engine, and then, with practiced ease, pulled the heavy canvas tarp over the crates. He cinched the ropes tight, his knuckles white with the effort, ensuring his cargo was shielded from both the weather and prying eyes. This truck, a sturdy, unassuming Ford Model T, was his partner, his fortress, and his cage. Its engine rumbled to life with a familiar, comforting growl, and Stanley slipped behind the wheel, the cold leather of the seat a familiar embrace. The city passed in a blur of shimmering lights and deep shadows. He navigated the streets with an ingrained knowledge, a map of back alleys and quiet boulevards etched into his mind. He avoided the main thoroughfares, the domains of patrol cars and rival outfits, who would sooner put a bullet in his tires than let a competitor's shipment reach its destination. His world was one of constant low-grade tension, a hum of anxiety that lived just beneath his skin. It was a feeling he'd become accustomed to, first in France and now here, in the urban jungle of his own country. An hour later, he was well beyond the city limits, on a deserted stretch of road that cut through fallow farmland. The rain had softened to a persistent drizzle, and the only sound was the rhythmic slap of the wiper on the windshield and the steady thrum of the engine. It was on this lonely road that he felt a flicker of unease. It wasn't a sound or a sight, but a feeling, a subtle shift in the way the truck handled, a whisper of imbalance he wouldn't have noticed if he wasn't so intimately attuned to every groan and shudder of his vehicle. Then he saw it in the rear-view mirror. A corner of the canvas tarp had worked itself loose, flapping in the wind like a frantic, dark wing. It was a small thing, but small things got men killed in his line of work. A loose tarp could catch the eye of a passing patrolman. It could expose the cargo. It was sloppy. And Stanley was never sloppy. With a muttered curse, he pulled the truck over onto the muddy shoulder of the road, killing the engine. The sudden silence was immense, broken only by the patter of rain on the roof. He sat for a full minute, scanning the darkness in every direction. The road was empty. The fields were black voids. Satisfied he was alone, He grabbed a heavy iron wrench from under his seat, a tool for repairs but also a serviceable weapon, and stepped out into the damp night. The air was cold and clean, smelling of wet earth. He walked to the back of the truck, his boots sinking slightly into the soft mud. The loose corner of the tarp snapped and fluttered, a frantic, insistent sound in the quiet. He reached up to grab it, his fingers numb with cold, and was about to pull it taut when he heard it. A sound so faint it was almost lost in the drizzle. A soft, choked gasp. A human sound. He froze. Every nerve in his body went rigid. His mind, trained in the brutal calculus of survival, raced through the possibilities. A rival gangster hiding amongst the crates, waiting for an ambush. A federal agent lying in wait. His hand tightened on the iron wrench, his knuckles turning bloodless. He moved with a predator's silence, his feet making no sound on the wet ground. He reached the side of the truck, his heart a cold, hard knot in his chest. With a single, decisive movement, he ripped the canvas tarp back. The ropes groaned in protest, and the heavy fabric fell away, exposing the neatly stacked wooden crates. And there, wedged into a small gap between a stack of fine Canadian spirits and the side panel of the truck bed, was the source of the sound. It was not a gangster. It was not a G-man. It was a woman, or rather a girl who looked to be barely out of her teens. She was curled into a tight ball, her body trembling violently from cold and fear. She wore a simple, elegant traveling dress, the kind of fine wool garment a lady of quality might wear, now soaked through and stained with grime. Her dark, bobbed hair was plastered to her pale skin, and her face was smudged with dirt. But it was her eyes that held him captive. Wide and the color of a stormy sea, they stared up at him, filled not with the pleading he might have expected, but with a desperate, cornered defiance. She looked like a frightened doe, but one that would bite if he got too close. For a long moment the world seemed to stop. The rain, the cold, the $1,000 cargo, all of it faded away. There was only the sight of this impossible, out-of-place creature huddled amongst his illegal wares. His mind, which had been preparing for violence, struggled to recalibrate. Then the cold reality crashed back in, and with it came a wave of pure, unadulterated fury. A stowaway, a secret passenger. It was a complication of such catastrophic proportions that he could barely comprehend it. She was a witness, a liability, a loose thread that could unravel his entire solitary existence. Every instinct, every lesson learned in the trenches and on the streets screamed at him. Get rid of her, leave her on the side of the road, she is not your problem. He raised the heavy wrench in his hand, its metal glinting faintly in the gloom. He didn't intend to use it, not really, but it was a manifestation of the cold rage boiling inside him. This girl, this stranger, had just trespassed into the one part of the world he controlled, and in doing so, had put a noose around both their necks. He took a step closer, his shadow falling over her small, shivering form. He opened his mouth to deliver a threat, an order, something to erase her from his path. "Who the hell are you?" he growled, his voice a low, gravelly rasp he hadn't used since the war. The girl flinched at the sound, but her gaze didn't waver. Her chin lifted a fraction, a small, almost imperceptible act of courage that was utterly insane given her circumstances. Stanley stared down at her, the rain dripping from the brim of his hat, the cold iron of the wrench a heavy weight in his hand. The heart he thought had turned to stone long ago gave a strange, unfamiliar lurch. This was not a problem he could solve with a threat or a fist. This was something else entirely. And as he stood there, frozen on that dark, forgotten road, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. His carefully controlled, solitary life had just ended. The iron wrench felt unnaturally heavy in Stanley's hand. For a breathless moment, the girl, Evelyn, he would soon learn, stared at the weapon, then back at his face, her gaze unwavering. The brutal logic of his world screamed at him. She was a witness, a complication, a loose end in a business that thrived on having none. The simplest, safest solution was to force her out of the truck and drive away, leaving her to the mercy of the rain and the empty road. It was what any other man in his position would do. It was what the man he had become was supposed to do. But the boy he had been, the one who'd enlisted with ideals about honor and protection before the war, bled them out of him, stirred somewhere in the dust-filled attic of his soul. It wasn't pity that stayed his hand. He'd seen enough suffering to become numb to pity. It was the defiance in her eyes. It was the same stubborn refusal to break that he'd seen in young soldiers facing down an artillery barrage, a desperate courage that made no logical sense and yet demanded a kind of infuriating respect. He lowered the wrench slowly, the metal making a soft thud as he placed it back on the truck bed. The sound seemed to break the spell. "Get out," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. It was a test. She didn't move. Her teeth were chattering, a frantic, uncontrollable rhythm, but her eyes held his. "I can't." The words were barely a whisper, yet they landed with the force of a physical blow. They weren't a plea, they were a statement of fact. For her, going back was not an option. "That's not my problem," Stanley countered, the coldness in his voice a shield. "You being here is a problem, a big one. One that gets people like me killed or sent to Leavenworth for 20 years. "I won't say anything," she promised, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "I don't even know who you are, and I plan to keep it that way." He took a step back, gesturing with his head toward the dark road. "Start walking. There's a town about 10 miles east. You'll make it by morning if you're lucky." For the first time, a flicker of genuine panic broke through her composure. Her eyes widened. 10 miles? In this? Please, I have money. Not much, but I can pay you for passage. Just to the next city, anywhere. Stanley almost laughed. It would have been a harsh, ugly sound. Money, as if a few dollars could offset the risk of harboring a fugitive. Whose fugitive was she, anyway? She was too well dressed for a common runaway. Her speech was educated, refined. She was a lady, which made her presence in the back of his liquor truck all the more bizarre and dangerous. "Name," he demanded, cutting through her pleas. "Evelyn," she answered, her shoulders slumping slightly in weary relief as she sensed a crack in his resolve. "Evelyn Reed." "And where are you going, Evelyn Reed?" She hesitated. "Away." It was a destination Stanley understood all too well. He let out a long, slow breath, the vapor pluming in the cold air. Every instinct for self-preservation told him to walk away. But her words, "I can't go back," echoed in his mind. He was a man who had built his life on moving forward, on never looking back at the horrors he'd left behind in France, or the family he'd lost to the influenza epidemic. He understood the desperate need for flight. "I'm running away," she added, her voice dropping so low he had to strain to hear it over the rain. "From a marriage. To a man I cannot marry. His name is Walter Vance." The name meant nothing to him, but the terror it evoked in her was palpable. It gave her desperation a concrete form. This wasn't a girlish whim. This was an escape. He stood there for another minute, torn between a decade of hard-won cynicism and a single foolish impulse. The rain continued its steady tattoo on the canvas. Finally, with a curse that was aimed more at himself than at her, he made a decision. It was a stupid decision, a reckless one, and he knew even as he made it that he would live to regret it. "Get in the cab," he grunted, not looking at her. "But you say one word, you make one sound that I don't like, and you'll be walking. Understood?" A wave of disbelief, followed by overwhelming gratitude, washed over her face. She nodded quickly, scrambling out from between the crates, her movements stiff and clumsy from the cold. She nearly slipped on the wet truck bed, and he shot out a hand, grabbing her arm to steady her. Her skin was ice cold, even through the fabric of her dress. The contact was brief, impersonal, but it sent a strange jolt through him. He let go as if he'd been burned. The journey resumed in a silence that was heavier and more charged than before. The cab of the Ford T was a cramped, intimate space, smelling of damp wool, gasoline, and Evelyn's faint, ladylike scent of lavender soap. She sat pressed against the passenger door, trying to make herself as small as possible, a shivering bundle of misery. Her constant, quiet trembling began to grate on his nerves. Without a word, he reached under his seat and pulled out a dented silver flask. He uncapped it and pushed it toward her. She looked at it, then at him, her eyes wide with uncertainty. "It's whiskey," he said, his voice impatient. "The good stuff, drink it. It'll stop the shaking." She took it with trembling hands, brought it to her lips, and took a small, hesitant sip. She coughed, her throat unaccustomed to the raw burn of the spirit, but she took another, deeper swallow. A faint flush of color returned to her cheeks. She handed the flask back, her fingers brushing his for a fraction of a second. Again, that strange current. He ignored it, took a long pull from the flask himself, and put it away. They drove on, the rhythmic slap, slap, slap of the windshield wipers counting out the miles. He kept his eyes fixed on the narrow tunnel of road illuminated by his headlights. He could feel her gaze on him, studying his profile in the dim glow of the dashboard. He was acutely aware of her presence, of the soft sound of her breathing. His truck had always been a solitary sanctuary, an extension of himself. Now it felt invaded, violated. He risked a sideways glance. In the faint light, he could see the details he'd missed outside. The delicate line of her jaw, the dark, long lashes framing those startling eyes. There was a quiet dignity about her, even in her disheveled state. She was from a different world, a world of manicured lawns and polite conversation, a world he now only serviced from the shadows. "He collects beautiful things," she said suddenly, her voice quiet but clear over the engine's drone. Stanley didn't respond, hoping his silence would be enough to end the conversation. It wasn't. "Walter, my fiancé," she clarified. "He has a house full of them. Vases from the Ming Dynasty, Persian rugs, Italian paintings. He sees me as another acquisition, something to be owned, displayed, and locked away when he's done admiring it." She hugged herself, rubbing her arms for warmth. "I tried to tell my father, but our families have business ties. The merger, that's what they call our marriage, is worth millions. A daughter's happiness is a small price to pay." Stanley remained silent, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He didn't want to hear her story. He didn't want to know the details. Knowing made her real, transformed her from a piece of dangerous cargo into a person. And a person was a responsibility he was not equipped to handle. Yet, her words found purchase in the barren soil of his own past. Trapped. He knew what that felt like. He'd been trapped in a trench with the sky exploding above him. He was trapped now in this life, running illegal liquor in the dead of night, forever looking over his shoulder. Her cage was gilded. His was made of mud and fear, but it was a cage all the same. He reached behind the seat again, this time pulling out a coarse wool blanket. He tossed it onto her lap. "Here." She wrapped it around her shoulders, murmuring a thank you. The violent shivering subsided into a slight tremor. The warmth of the whiskey and the blanket seemed to loosen her tongue further. "I heard the servants talking about a truck that passes through the old country road behind our estate every month, like clockwork. They said it carried secrets." She looked at him, her eyes searching his in the darkness. "I waited for hours in the rain. I didn't know if you would even come. It was my only chance." Her planning was both naive and incredibly brave. He should have been angry at her recklessness, at the way she had implicated him in her personal drama. Instead, a grudging admiration took root. She wasn't just a passenger, she was a fighter. For the rest of the drive, they sat in a silence that was no longer hostile, but filled with the weight of things unsaid. She had shared the bare, sharp-edged pieces of her story, and he had offered nothing in return but whiskey and a blanket. It was an uneven exchange, yet it felt like a treaty had been signed in the dark cab of the truck. Hours later, the first signs of a town appeared on the horizon, a few scattered, dim lights under a sky that was just beginning to soften from black to a deep indigo. It was a bleak, desolate-looking place, little more than a gas pump, a general store, and a handful of sad clapboard houses. This was it, the end of the line, the place where he would drop her off and reclaim his solitude. He pulled the truck to a stop at the edge of the town, the engine idling roughly. The moment had come. "This is as far as you go," he said, his voice sounding harsher than he intended. Evelyn looked out at the sleeping town. It looked cold and unwelcoming. There was nowhere for her to go, no one to turn to. The fear returned to her eyes, more potent now that a sliver of hope had been allowed to grow. She turned back to him, the blanket clutched around her like a shield. "Thank you," she said, her voice genuine. "You didn't have to help me, I won't forget it." She made a move to open the door, to step out into the cold pre-dawn gloom and disappear from his life forever. He watched her, his jaw tight. This was what he wanted, for her to be gone, for the problem to be solved. He was a bootlegger. He broke the law for a living, took risks for profit, and trusted no one. But as he looked at her small, determined form, about to step into an unknown and hostile world alone, he felt the sharp, unfamiliar edge of a different kind of law, one that had nothing to do with federal agents or rival gangs. "Wait," he heard himself say. Evelyn paused, her hand on the door handle, and looked back at him, a question in her stormy eyes. Stanley stared out the windshield, at the grey, unforgiving landscape. He could feel the delicate architecture of his life, the one he had so carefully constructed from silence and solitude, begin to groan under a new and unexpected weight. He was in trouble, deeper than any shipment of Canadian whiskey had ever taken him. The word hung in the cold air of the cab, a single unplanned syllable that altered the trajectory of both their lives. "Wait." Stanley hadn't known he was going to say it until it was already out. It felt foreign on his tongue, a word from a language he no longer spoke. Evelyn turned back from the door, her expression a mixture of confusion and a fragile, burgeoning hope that was almost painful to witness. He didn't offer an explanation. He couldn't. To explain it would be to acknowledge the strange protective instinct she had awakened in him, and that was a territory far more dangerous than any back road in Illinois. He simply put the truck in gear and pulled away from the bleak little town, leaving it behind in the rearview mirror as the sun began to bleed a pale, watery light across the horizon. Evelyn didn't ask where they were going. She seemed to understand that questions were a currency he did not trade in. She simply pulled the wool blanket tighter around her shoulders and settled back into her seat, a silent passenger once more. The unspoken agreement was clear. Her journey was not over, and for now his solitude was a luxury he had to forfeit. The rest of the drive to Chicago was tense. With the dawn came new dangers. The cloak of darkness was gone, and his truck, with its illicit cargo, was now a conspicuous target on the open road. Stanley's eyes were constantly scanning the horizon, checking his mirror for the telltale shape of a police cruiser or the menacing silhouette of a rival's sedan. He drove with a controlled urgency, pushing the Ford T to its limits. He felt Evelyn's presence beside him not as a comfort, but as a constant, humming wire of anxiety. He was responsible for her now. The thought was a lead weight in his stomach. Responsibility was what he had fled after the war, after the flu had claimed his parents and his younger sister, leaving him utterly alone. He had embraced the life of a phantom, a man with no ties and no obligations. Now this slip of a girl with stormy eyes was anchoring him to the world in a way he hadn't been in years. They were about 30 miles from the city, on a stretch of road flanked by dense woods, when Stanley saw it. A black Packard sedan, parked casually on the shoulder up ahead. It was too clean, too powerful for this rural route. 3 men stood beside it, pretending to look at a flat tire, but their posture was all wrong. They weren't mechanics in distress. They were predators waiting for their prey. "Trouble," he said, his voice low and tight. Evelyn's head snapped up. She followed his gaze and saw the car. "Police?" "Worse," he answered, his hands gripping the steering wheel. "Competition." He had 2 choices: stop and try to bluff his way through, or floor it and hope for the best. Given the value of his cargo and the looks of the men, bluffing wasn't an option. "Get down," he commanded, his voice sharp. "As low as you can." Evelyn didn't hesitate. She slid from the seat and onto the floor of the cab, curling into a ball at his feet. As they drew closer to the Packard, one of the men stepped into the road, holding up a hand. Stanley ignored him. He pressed his foot down on the accelerator, and the Ford T's engine roared in protest as it surged forward. The man in the road scrambled out of the way just in time. The peaceful morning air was shattered by the sharp crack of a gunshot. Then another. Stanley heard the sickening thud of a bullet, embedding itself in one of the wooden crates behind him. He swerved, the truck's tires screeching on the pavement, and glanced in the mirror. The black Packard was now in pursuit, its powerful engine easily closing the distance. "Stay down!" he yelled over the engine's roar. Another shot rang out, this one much closer. The passenger side window exploded, showering the cab in a crystalline spray of glass. Evelyn cried out, a sharp, terrified sound. Stanley risked a glance down. She was huddled on the floor, her hands over her head, miraculously unharmed. The sight of her, so utterly vulnerable, ignited a cold, focused rage within him. This was no longer just about protecting his cargo. He knew these roads better than they did. It was his only advantage. Up ahead, a dirt track, barely visible, veered off into the woods. It was a gamble. The track was rough, and in the rain-soaked terrain he could easily get stuck. But the wide, heavy Packard would have even more trouble. It was his only chance. He wrenched the steering wheel hard to the right. The truck bucked and fishtailed as it left the smooth road, crashing through a thicket of bushes and onto the muddy track. Branches scraped and screeched along the side of the vehicle like claws. The ride was punishing, jostling them violently as they bounced over ruts and rocks. Behind them, the Packard followed, its driver fighting to control the larger car on the treacherous ground. The woods were a blur of green and brown. A bullet slammed into the metal of the driver's side door, inches from Stanley's arm. He didn't flinch. His entire being was focused on the path ahead, on the delicate dance between speed and control. He was no longer just a driver. He was a soldier in a trench again, navigating a no-man's land of mud and death. He saw an opportunity, a sharp bend in the track around a massive oak tree. As he approached it, he slammed on the brakes. The truck slid sideways in the mud, its rear end swinging around. For a terrifying second, it felt like they would roll, but the tires caught and the vehicle shuddered to a halt, perfectly blocking the narrow path. Before the men in the Packard could react, Stanley grabbed the iron wrench from the seat, kicked open his door and dove into the thick undergrowth of the forest. He landed in a tangle of wet leaves and ferns, the cold mud soaking through his trousers. The Packard screeched to a halt behind his truck. Doors slammed, angry voices shouted, "He's in the trees! Find him!" Stanley lay perfectly still, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was exposed, armed with only a wrench against men with guns. But they didn't know about Evelyn. They would be focused on him, the driver. He had to draw them away from the truck. He crawled deeper into the woods, moving with a silence he hadn't known he still possessed. He could hear them crashing through the brush, their city shoes slipping in the mud. He waited, letting them pass his position, his breathing slow and even. When they were a good 20 yards past him, he rose into a crouch and doubled back toward the road, a ghost in the dappled morning light. He reached the truck. The cab was empty. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him for a second before he saw her. She was huddled behind the front wheel on the passenger side, exactly where he would have told her to hide. Her eyes were wide with terror, but she was silent, her hand pressed against her mouth. He put a finger to his lips, then pointed toward the Packard. Its engine was still running. Understanding dawned on her face. It was a desperate, insane plan, but it was the only one they had. The sounds of the gangsters searching for him were getting farther away. It was now or never. He moved first, a low, silent shadow darting from his truck to theirs. He slid into the driver's seat of the Packard. The leather was plush, the engine a low, powerful purr. The keys were in the ignition. He gestured for Evelyn. She ran, her feet slipping in the mud, and threw herself into the passenger seat. He slammed the car into reverse, spun the wheel, and floored the accelerator. The Packard's tires threw up great plumes of mud as it shot backward, then forward, turning a tight, messy circle on the narrow track. He didn't look back as they sped away, leaving the gangsters stranded in the woods with his broken-down, bullet-riddled truck and its cargo of whiskey. They had lost the shipment, but they had gained their lives. Neither of them spoke as they raced back toward the main road. The adrenaline was a wild, metallic taste in Stanley's mouth. He glanced at Evelyn. Her face was pale, her dress was torn, and she had a small cut on her cheek from the shattered glass, but she was alive. She was looking at him, not with fear or gratitude, but with a kind of awe. The shared brush with death had burned away the last of their pretense. They were no longer a bootlegger and a runaway. They were survivors, comrades. When they were finally back on the paved road, heading toward the familiar smog of the city, Evelyn finally spoke, her voice trembling slightly. I thought we were going to die." "We were," Stanley said, his voice rough. Today was just not our day for it. He knew he couldn't take her to a hotel or leave her at a train station. The men from the woods worked for someone, and that someone would now be looking for a man and a woman who had stolen their car. He had lost his truck, his cargo, and his anonymity. He had only one place to go, one sanctuary in the entire city that might be safe. It was a place of noise, smoke, and secrets, a place where the music was loud enough to drown out the sound of the world falling apart. He drove them into the heart of the city, to a nondescript alley behind a brick building with no sign. He led her down a flight of stairs into the warm, vibrating darkness of a basement. The air was thick with the smells of stale beer, perfume, and something else, something electric and alive. The muffled, chaotic sounds from the alley resolved themselves into the sultry, improvisational wail of a saxophone. They had arrived at the Blue Dahlia, a speakeasy, a jazz club, and Stanley's only real home. As the music washed over them, a mournful, beautiful blues, Stanley watched Evelyn. Her eyes, which had been filled with terror only an hour before, now held a different light. In the heart of this hidden, illegal world, surrounded by the soulful sound of the jazz, she looked, for the first time since he'd met her, like she might be free. The Blue Dahlia was a world away from the rain-soaked, muddy forest. The air in the basement club was thick enough to drink, a potent cocktail of cigarette smoke, spilled gin, cheap perfume, and a desperate, defiant joy. A 5-piece band was crowded onto a small makeshift stage, their bodies swaying in unison. The heart of their sound was the saxophone, played by a man with his eyes closed, pouring every ounce of his sorrow and soul into the mournful, looping melody of a blues number. Couples danced in the small space between the tables, their movements fluid and intimate, oblivious to the world of law and order that existed just a flight of stairs above them. Stanley led Evelyn to a small secluded table in a dark corner, shielded from the main floor by a beaded curtain. A woman with weary eyes and a knowing smile, Mildred, the club's owner, saw them enter. She caught Stanley's eye and gave a subtle nod, a silent acknowledgement that asked no questions. This was a place built on the foundation of secrets. He left Evelyn at the table and returned a moment later with 2 glasses of gin and a small bowl of water with a clean rag. He sat down opposite her, the small table feeling like an island in the swirling sea of music and humanity. For the first time he saw her properly, not as a shivering stowaway or a terrified passenger, but as a person. The dim, warm light of the club was kind to her, softening the harsh lines of fear on her face. Evelyn looked around, her eyes wide with a kind of stunned wonder. She had never been anywhere like this. The world she came from was one of string quartets and polite applause, of rigid postures and whispered judgments. This place was raw, alive, and achingly real. The music wasn't a performance to be observed. It was a living thing that pulsed in the air, in the floorboards, in the very marrow of your bones. It seemed to enter her, uncoiling the tight knot of fear that had been lodged in her chest since she'd climbed into his truck. "I've never heard music like this," she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet he heard her perfectly over the band. "It's the blues," Stanley replied simply. "It's what happens when you give a broken heart a voice." He saw her absorb that, her gaze drifting back to the saxophone player, a new understanding in her eyes. She too had a broken heart, though it had never been given a voice. Without a word he dipped the rag in the water and leaned forward. "Hold still," he murmured. She flinched instinctively as he reached for her face, but then held his gaze, a silent act of trust. His touch was surprisingly gentle, his rough, calloused fingers a stark contrast to the careful way he dabbed at the small cut on her cheek where the glass had grazed her. His movements were efficient, practiced, the way a soldier would tend a wound in the field. The noise of the club seemed to fade away. In that small, intimate space, there was only the sound of their breathing and the faint clink of glass on the table. He was so close he could see the flecks of gray in her stormy blue eyes, the slight tremor of her lips. He smelled the clean scent of her skin beneath the grime and the rain. He felt the warmth of her breath. A current, stronger than any he'd felt before, passed between them, a silent, powerful acknowledgement of all they had just endured together. When he finished, his hand lingered near her face for a fraction of a second too long. It was a hesitation, a crack in the fortress of his composure. Evelyn didn't pull away. She leaned into the warmth of his presence, her eyes searching his. "You saved my life," she said softly. "We saved each other's," he corrected, his voice gravelly as he pulled his hand back and sat down. "Forgetting to mention you're engaged to a man with an army of trigger-happy thugs would have been useful information." A shadow crossed her face. "I didn't know. I knew he was cruel, possessive, but not that. I'm so sorry I've dragged you into—" "It's done," he cut her off, not wanting her apology. He didn't want her gratitude or her guilt. He didn't know what he wanted. The band shifted from the slow blues to a more upbeat, infectious jazz rhythm. The mood of the room lifted, the dancers' feet moving faster. And then Stanley saw something he didn't think was possible. As Evelyn watched a young couple laughing as they fumbled their way through a clumsy Charleston, a slow, genuine smile spread across her face. It started in her eyes and lit up her entire expression. It was the first time he had seen it, and the effect was like the sun breaking through a week of rain. It transformed her, chasing away the last of the fear and revealing the vibrant, beautiful woman who had been hiding underneath. The sight hit him with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. It was in that moment that he understood the true depth of the trouble he was in. He, Stanley, the man who felt nothing, was feeling something. And it terrified him more than any gunfight. Their fragile peace lasted for one more song. As the trumpet player took a soaring, brilliant solo, 2 men stepped through the beaded curtain that shielded their alcove. They were not patrons. They were tall and broad, dressed in impeccably tailored dark suits that failed to hide the bulge of shoulder holsters. Their faces were hard and impassive, their eyes cold and empty. They moved with the quiet confidence of men who were used to being feared. The smile vanished from Evelyn's face, replaced by a stark, bone-white terror. She shrank back in her chair. Stanley was instantly on his feet, positioning himself between her and the intruders. The music still played, the dancers still danced, but in their small corner of the club, the world had gone silent and cold. "Stanley," the lead man said. His name was Clarence. a known enforcer for the city's most powerful outfit. His voice was calm, almost pleasant, which made it all the more menacing. "Been a while. You've been keeping busy, I hear, and making new friends." His gaze flickered to Evelyn, a dismissive, proprietary look that made Stanley's hands clench into fists. "This is between me and her," Stanley said, his voice a low growl. "You have no business here." Clarence chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "That's where you're wrong. You see, you made this our business when you interfered with the property of Mr. Walter Vance." He took a step closer, his eyes locking with Stanley's. "And Mr. Vance is a very important business partner to our mutual acquaintance, Mr. Torrio." The name landed in the small space like a bomb. Johnny Torrio, the head of the Chicago outfit, the undisputed king of the city's underworld. Stanley had built his entire solitary operation on one principle: stay small, stay independent, and never, ever cross Johnny Torrio. He ran his liquor on the margins, in the cracks the big outfits didn't bother with. He paid his dues when necessary and made himself invisible. Now he was standing face to face with one of Torrio's top men, who was telling him that the society fiancé Evelyn was running from was in bed with the most dangerous man in Chicago. The chase in the woods, the stolen car, it wasn't just a squabble with a rival gang, it was an insult to the throne. "Mr. Vance wants the girl back, unharmed," Clarence continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He's a sentimental man. As for you, Mr. Torrio is disappointed. He doesn't like loose cannons on his streets. He considers your actions disrespectful. He's giving you one chance to make it right. Give us the girl and we'll forget we ever saw you." Stanley looked from Clarence's cold, dead eyes to Evelyn's terrified face. He saw her future in that moment, locked away in Walter's mansion, her spirit broken, that beautiful, rare smile extinguished forever. He thought of the trenches, of the promises he'd made to himself about what he would do if he ever got out alive. He had promised he would never again be a pawn in some rich man's war. He had a choice, a simple, clear choice. He could hand her over, save his own skin and go back to his life of shadows. He could go back to being a ghost, or he could stand his ground. It was an insane choice. It was suicide. He looked at Evelyn, and he remembered her smile. "You can tell Mr. Vance, and you can tell Mr. Torrio," Stanley said, his voice steady and clear, "to go to hell." Clarence's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something, surprise, respect, passed through his eyes. He nodded slowly. "A shame," he said softly. He turned, and without another word he and the other man melted back into the crowd. They hadn't drawn a weapon. They hadn't needed to. They had just delivered a death sentence. Stanley slumped back into his chair, the adrenaline draining out of him, leaving a cold, heavy dread in its place. He hadn't just stolen a car and defied a jealous fiancé. He had declared war on the most powerful criminal organization in the city, and he had done it for a girl he barely knew, a girl whose smile he had only just seen for the very first time. The last notes of the saxophone faded into the smoky air of the Blue Dahlia, but for Stanley, the music had already died. Clarence's words echoed in the sudden quiet, a death knell for the fragile peace they had found. Johnny Torrio, Walter Vance. The names were two heads of a monstrous hydra, and he had just spat in both their faces. He looked at Evelyn. The terror was back in her eyes, but this time it was different. It was mingled with a fierce protective concern for him. In that moment, he realized she wasn't just a passenger he was protecting, she was a partner in a war he had just declared, and soldiers protect their own by getting them off the battlefield. "We have to go," he said, his voice low and urgent. He stood, grabbing her hand. His touch was firm, impersonal, pulling her through the beaded curtain and past the oblivious dancers. Mildred met his eyes as they passed the bar. He didn't have to say a word. She saw the grim set of his jaw and simply dipped her head, a silent farewell that spoke volumes. In their world, goodbyes were often swift and permanent. He led her out the back alley and into the cold pre-dawn air of the city that was now hunting them. He had no truck, no cargo, only a stolen Packard, and the most dangerous liability in Chicago sitting beside him. He drove aimlessly for a while, the city's grid of streets a labyrinth with no exit. Every pair of headlights in his rear-view mirror was a potential threat. Every shadow in an alley held a phantom gunman. His mind worked with the cold, brutal clarity of a field commander planning a retreat. He couldn't protect her here. Torrio's organization was the city's central nervous system. Its tendrils reached everywhere, every police precinct, every train station, every hotel. To stay in Chicago with her was to sentence them both to death. There was only one option, and it was a choice that felt like tearing out his own heart. He had to send her away. He drove to a desolate industrial area by the rail yards, parking the Packard in the shadow of a rusted water tower. In the grey, sterile light of dawn, he turned to her. "I know a man," he began, the words tasting like ash. "His name is Roy. We served together in the war. He runs a quiet boarding house in a small town in Ohio called Havenwood. No one will look for you there. It's quiet, safe." Evelyn stared at him, her mind slowly processing his words. "You're taking me there?" "No," he said, and the single word was a physical blow. "I'm putting you on a train, alone. I'll give you the address and enough money to last you months. You'll tell Roy that Stanley sent you. He'll understand." The hope in her eyes died, replaced by a wounded, horrified disbelief. "No, I'm not leaving you. We're in this together now. I'm the reason they're after you. I won't run and hide while you—" "While I what?" He cut her off, his voice deliberately harsh. He had to be cruel to be kind. He had to make her want to leave. "While I get a bullet in my head because I'm trying to play nursemaid to a runaway debutante. You don't get it. This isn't a game. These men, they don't lose. You being with me is a liability. You're a beacon that leads them right to my door." Each word was a calculated lie designed to wound, and each one felt like a shard of glass in his own throat. He saw the hurt blossom on her face, saw her flinch as if he'd slapped her. It was working, and it was killing him. "I'm not a liability," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and pain. I trust you." "Then trust me now," he said, his voice softening for just a moment, the mask slipping. "This is the only way. The only way either of us survives this. You have to disappear, and so do I." He reached into his coat and pulled out a thick roll of bills, nearly everything he had in the world. He pressed it into her hand, along with a scrap of paper on which he'd scribbled Roy's address. Her fingers were cold. He held them for a second, the contact a desperate, silent plea for her to understand. The train station was a place of ghosts. People rushed past, wrapped in their own worlds, their own departures and arrivals. On the windswept platform, waiting for the 6:15 eastbound train, Stanley and Evelyn stood a few feet apart, caught in a bubble of suffocating silence. The words had all been said. All that remained was the tearing apart. The train's whistle blew, a mournful cry in the morning air. It was time. "Go," he said, his voice a rough command. She looked at him, her stormy eyes swimming with unshed tears. She wanted to say something, to rage, to plead, but she saw the finality in his expression. She saw the profound, weary pain he was trying so hard to hide beneath his stony facade. She finally understood. This wasn't an abandonment. It was a sacrifice. She nodded once, a small, jerky movement. She turned and walked toward the train car without looking back, a small, proud figure swallowed by the crowd. Stanley stood rooted to the spot, watching until the train pulled away from the station, its rhythmic clatter a countdown to his new, empty reality. He stayed on the platform until the last car had vanished from sight, taking with it the only thing that had made him feel human in 8 years. Then he turned, pulled his fedora low, and disappeared back into the shadows of the city. A ghost once more. Separated, their lives took on a stark, dual rhythm of survival. For Stanley, the grief and fear curdled into a cold, methodical fury. He was no longer just a bootlegger. He was an instrument of vengeance. Walter Vance wanted a war. Stanley would give him one, but it would be a war fought on his terms. He was a phantom, and he would haunt every corner of Vance's burgeoning criminal enterprise. He abandoned the Packard and acquired an old, unremarkable Chevrolet. He slept in flop houses, his bed a different lumpy mattress every night. He lived on stale coffee and pure adrenaline. Using his intricate knowledge of the region's smuggling routes, he began to systematically dismantle Vance's supply lines. An anonymous tip to a prohibition agent would lead to a raid on a warehouse in Gary. A deliberately placed pile of nails on a deserted back road would disable a convoy of liquor trucks just long enough for a rival gang to happen upon them. He spread whispers and lies in speakeasies, turning Vance's partners against him, seeding distrust. He was a saboteur, a ghost in the machine, causing 1,000 tiny cuts that were slowly bleeding his enemy dry. Every seized shipment, every failed delivery, was a silent letter to Evelyn, a testament to the promise he'd made to keep her safe. Hundreds of miles away, Evelyn arrived in Havenwood, Ohio. The town was the complete antithesis of Chicago, a quiet, sleepy place where the loudest sound was the church bell on Sunday morning. Roy, Stanley's friend, was was a kind, steady man with his wife's gentle eyes and a quiet understanding that precluded the need for questions. He and his wife, Florence, gave Evelyn a small, clean room at the back of their boarding house overlooking a garden. For the first few weeks, Evelyn was a ghost herself. She stayed in her room, paralyzed by fear for Stanley and the suffocating weight of her new, isolated life. She wrote long, desperate letters to him that she knew she could never send, filling pages with the words she hadn't been able to say on the train platform. But the girl who had been brave enough to hide in a bootlegger's truck was not meant for a passive existence. One afternoon, Florence found her humming a sad, simple tune while helping to peel potatoes in the kitchen. Florence, who also ran the town's small cafe, had an idea. "You have a lovely voice, dear," she said. "We have a piano player on Friday nights. The town could use a new song." The thought terrified Evelyn. To be seen, to be heard. It was the opposite of everything she was supposed to be doing. But the thought of doing something, of pushing back against the silence, was a powerful lure. That Friday, she stood beside the old upright piano in the corner of the Corner Cup Cafe, her hands trembling. The small crowd of farmers and shopkeepers looked on with mild curiosity. She chose a song she'd heard in The Blue Dahlia, a mournful blues ballad about a lost love and a long road home. When she began to sing, her voice was shaky, thin with fear. But then she closed her eyes and thought of Stanley, of his grim, determined face on the train platform. She poured all her longing, all her fear, all her unspoken love into the melody. Her voice found its strength. It was not the trained, perfect voice of a society singer. It was something far more potent, a raw, honest sound, filled with the kind of authentic heartache that everyone in the room, in their own way, could understand. When she finished, there was a moment of stunned silence, and then the small cafe erupted in heartfelt applause. From that night on, singing became her salvation. It was her voice, her act of defiance. She was no longer just Walter Vance's runaway fiancé. She was Evelyn, the girl with the sad songs and the voice that could break your heart. She was earning her own money, making her own friends, and building a life, however small and fragile. But every song she sang was for an audience of one, a man in a trench coat fighting a war for her in a city of shadows, a man she prayed every night she would one day see again. Her growing fame in the small town was a balm to her soul, but she was unaware that a voice that beautiful, a story that unique, was bound to travel. And whispers, like the ones Stanley was spreading in Chicago, had a way of reaching the wrong ears. The Chicago winter descended with a vengeance, its icy breath sweeping off Lake Michigan and encasing the city in a sheath of gray. For Stanley, the cold was a constant companion, a physical manifestation of the frozen landscape of his own heart. He moved through the city's underbelly like a wraith, his campaign of sabotage against Walter Vance, a grim and solitary obsession. It had been 4 months since he'd put Evelyn on that train, 4 months of living on the edge, fueled by black coffee and a burning, protective rage. His efforts were having an effect. Vance's operation, once a model of efficiency, was now hemorrhaging money. Shipments vanished, warehouses were raided, and paranoia was spreading through his organization like a fever. Stanley was a ghost, a rumor, a curse, but he knew it couldn't last. He was a single man chipping away at a mountain, and sooner or later the mountain would collapse on him. The break came on a Tuesday night, in the back room of a dingy pool hall where bets were placed and information was sold. Stanley, disguised in a worker's cap and cheap overalls, was nursing a glass of rot-gut gin when he overheard 2 of Vance's disgruntled drivers complaining. "This whole operation is cursed," one of them grumbled. "First, the ghost sabotaging our routes, now this. The boss is putting everything on one last shipment." Stanley's ears perked up. He leaned closer, feigning drunkenness. "One last shipment?" the other driver scoffed. "After the mess we're in, not just any shipment," the first man whispered, his voice dropping. "It's the shipment, coming in from the coast. Enough prime-cut scotch to make Torrio king for the next 5 years. Vance is brokering the whole deal. It's supposed to be his big move, the one that makes everyone forget the recent unpleasantness. He's overseeing it himself. Friday night, Pier 4. The information hit Stanley like a physical blow. A shipment big enough to solidify a partnership with Torrio would make Walter Vance untouchable. It would cement his power, erase all his recent losses, and eliminate any remaining competition, including Stanley himself. It was a masterstroke, and it was almost certainly a trap. Vance had to know that the ghost sabotaging his operation would be drawn to such a massive prize. He would be waiting. Stanley's first instinct was to plan an attack, to find a way to destroy that shipment, even if it was the last thing he ever did. It was the culmination of his entire war. As he stood to leave, slipping out of the pool hall unnoticed, a newsboy on the corner was hawking the evening paper. "Extra, extra, society bride still at large. Vance offers reward." Stanley ignored him, but then a different shout caught his ear, this one from a man buying a paper. "Would you look at that? The songbird of Havenwood. Says here she's got a voice that'll make a grown man weep. Sounds like a nice little place, that Ohio." Havenwood. The name sliced through the fog of Stanley's thoughts, cold and sharp as a razor. He stopped dead in the street, the city's noise fading to a dull roar. He walked back to the newsboy, his hands trembling slightly as he handed over a nickel. He flipped past the sensational headlines about his own secret war and found the small article in the arts and culture section. It was a human interest piece, a whimsical story about a mysterious young woman with the voice of an angel who had appeared out of nowhere and captivated a small Ohioan town. There was a grainy photograph, slightly out of focus, but it was unmistakably her, Evelyn. The article didn't use her full name, but it described her in loving detail. Her stormy eyes, her dark bobbed hair, her sad, beautiful songs. It was a love letter to her talent, written by a local journalist, and it was a signed and delivered death warrant. He didn't have to wonder if Walter had seen it. A man that obsessive, that possessive, would have investigators scouring every corner of the country. A story this unique, this specific, would not go unnoticed. Vance now knew where she was. A chilling realization washed over him. The shipment on Friday night. It wasn't just a trap for him, it was a diversion. While the entire Chicago underworld and Stanley himself were focused on Pier 4, Vance would be free to travel. He would go to Havenwood and reclaim his property. He could be on his way right now. The world tilted on its axis. His war had never been about whiskey. It had been about her. And in his single-minded focus on hurting Vance, he had failed to see the most obvious threat. He ran to the nearest telegraph office, his mind racing. He had to warn Roy. He scribbled a hasty, coded message, "Storm coming east. Protect the package. I am on my way," and handed it to the clerk. He knew it was a flimsy shield against a man like Vance, but it was all he could do for now. As he stepped out of the office, the full weight of his dilemma crashed down upon him. He had a choice to make, and less than 48 hours to make it. He could go to Pier 4. He could try to destroy Vance's shipment, ruin him financially and professionally, and likely die in the process. It would be a blaze of glory, the final act of his vengeful crusade. Or he could turn his back on it all, the war, the whiskey, the last 4 months of his life, and race to Ohio. He could try to get to Evelyn before Vance did. He could not do both. He had to choose between his mission and his heart. For a man who had spent years convincing himself he didn't have a heart, the choice was agonizingly, terrifyingly clear. There was no choice at all. He abandoned everything. He went to a pawn shop and sold the last thing of value he owned, his father's gold watch, for a handful of cash. He didn't have enough to buy a train ticket, not one that would get him there fast enough, but he knew the railways better than most. That night, he became a different kind of ghost. He slipped into the sprawling, chaotic rail yards under the cover of darkness, the same yards he had once used to ship illegal liquor. He found the midnight express train heading east toward Cleveland. It was a passenger train, sleek and fast. As it began to pull away from the station, gathering speed, he ran alongside it, his lungs burning in the frigid air. With a final, desperate surge of strength, he grabbed onto the ladder of a baggage car and hauled himself aboard, clinging to the cold, unforgiving steel. The train thundered through the night, a river of light and speed carrying him away from Chicago. The wind was a physical assault, tearing at his clothes, its icy fingers trying to rip him from his perch. He was cold, he was exhausted, and he was heading into a confrontation he might not survive, armed with nothing but the sheer force of his will. But as the lights of the city that had been his prison receded into the darkness behind him, a strange sense of peace settled over him. He had made his choice. He had abandoned his cargo, his truck, his caution, and his war. He was no longer a bootlegger, no longer a saboteur. He was just a man hurtling through the dark, risking everything for the woman who had, against all odds, become the one thing in the world he could not bear to lose. He was racing against time, against a monster of a man, to get to the only person who had ever seen the heart beneath the armor. The final hand was being dealt, and he had just gone all in. The world was a smear of frozen darkness, as Stanley finally, agonizingly, dropped from the side of the baggage car. He landed with a bone-jarring thud on the gravel siding of the tracks, just outside Havenwood, his body a single screaming symphony of pain. Every muscle ached from the cold and the strain of clinging to the train for hours. He was bruised, half frozen, and running on nothing but the fumes of sheer will, but he was here. He scrambled up the embankment and into the sleeping town. It was just as he remembered from his one visit after the war. Quiet, decent, a world away from the hungry ghosts of Chicago. He ran through the empty streets, his breath pluming in the frigid air, heading for the warm light he knew would be burning in the window of Roy and Florence's boarding house. The door was thrown open before he could knock. Roy stood there, his face etched with worry. "Stanley, my God, we got your telegram. He's already here." Stanley's blood ran cold. "Here? In the house?" "No, thank heavens," Roy said, pulling him inside. "He arrived last night, smooth as you please, dressed like a king. Walked right into the cafe while Evelyn was singing. You should have seen her face. She went white as a sheet." "Where is she? Is she safe?" Stanley demanded, his hands clenching. "He didn't make a scene," Roy explained, his voice hurried. "He was clever, played the part of the repentant fiancé, apologized in front of the whole town, said he'd been a fool and just wanted to talk to her, to ensure she was safe before he let her go for good. He convinced her to walk with him to the train station this morning. The first train east leaves in 20 minutes. He said he wanted to see her off properly. A trap, a public psychological trap. Vance had cornered her not with force but with shame and social pressure, making it impossible for her to refuse, without causing a scene and revealing her secrets. Stanley looked at the grandfather clock in Roy's hall. 10 minutes until the train departed. "He has a man with him," Roy added, his voice grim. "A big fellow in a dark coat." Stanley didn't wait to hear more. He turned and bolted back out into the pre-dawn chill, his aching body forgotten. He ran toward the train station, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The station was a small wooden structure at the edge of town, shrouded in a thick morning mist that swirled like spirits around the gas lamps. He saw them on the nearly deserted platform. 3 figures, stark silhouettes against the gloom. Walter, looking impeccable in his expensive overcoat, a hulking brute standing a few feet behind him, and Evelyn. She stood stiffly, her arms wrapped around herself, her face pale and devoid of all the life he'd seen blossom there. Walter was speaking, his voice a low, poisonous murmur that carried on the cold air. "And of course, your father's business is in a precarious position. A word from me could ruin him, but I'm not a monster, my dear. I'm merely a man in love. Come home. This foolishness is over." Stanley stepped out of the mist. His appearance was so sudden, so impossible, that for a moment all 3 of them simply stared. He was a disheveled wreck, his coat torn, his face smudged with soot and creased with exhaustion. He looked more like a hobo than a hero, but in his eyes burned a fire that made Walter take an involuntary step back. "Stanley," Evelyn breathed, his name a prayer. Walter recovered first, a slow, cruel smile spreading across his lips. Well, the bootlegger. I must admit, I'm surprised. I expected you'd be down at Pier 4 trying to play the big hero. A pity you'll miss the show." "There is no show, Walter," Stanley said, his voice quiet but carrying an immense weight. He didn't look at Walter. He looked at the thug standing behind him. "And there is no shipment. Or rather there is. But your boss here forgot to mention one small detail." He took a step closer, his gaze locked on the hired muscle. "He never planned on selling that liquor. He planned on sinking it. He's got it insured for twice its value, and he tipped off the feds himself. When the raid happens, Torio's men are going to be the ones holding the bag, taking the fall. Your boss walks away with a fortune in insurance money, and Torio thinks a rival gang hit him. It's a clever plan. It was a complete fabrication, a desperate bluff spun from thin air, and his understanding of Vance's treacherous nature. The thug's impassive face flickered with uncertainty. He looked at Walter. "Don't listen to him, you idiot. He's lying," Walter snapped, his composure cracking. The venom in his voice, the flash of panic in his eyes, was all the confirmation his man needed. A seed of doubt, once planted in the mind of a gangster who values his own survival above all else, is a powerful poison. "He's using you," Stanley continued, his voice calm and steady. "When Torio finds out he's been played for a fool, who do you think he's going to come looking for first? The rich man with the lawyers, or the man on the dock who let it happen?" The train whistle blew, its mournful sound cutting through the tension. The thug looked from Stanley's unwavering, honest gaze to Walter's furious, deceitful one. He had served men like Vance his whole life. He knew a sacrificial pawn when he saw one. Without a word, he took a step back, then another, before turning and melting back into the mist, abandoning his post. His loyalty had been to a paycheck from a winner, not to a man about to start a war with Johnny Torrio. Walter stood there, his authority, his power, utterly stripped away. He was just a man in an expensive coat, alone on a misty platform. The snarl on his face was that of a cornered rat. "You'll pay for this," he hissed, his voice trembling with impotent rage. "Both of you." Evelyn, who had been watching this exchange with wide-eyed disbelief, finally found her voice. Seeing Walter without his armor of intimidation, she was no longer afraid. He was pathetic. "No, Walter," she said, her voice clear and strong. "We won't. You will." She walked to Stanley's side, slipping her hand into his. Their fingers intertwined, a silent, solid bond. Together they turned their backs on him and walked away, leaving him standing alone as the train he had intended to be her prison pulled into the station. His fate was no longer their concern. He had to return to Chicago, to a city of men he had betrayed. They walked through the waking town as the sun began to rise, painting the misty sky in hues of rose and gold. They didn't speak. There was nothing that needed to be said. In the alley behind Roy's boarding house was an old Ford T, much like the one Stanley had lost. Roy had kept it running. The keys were waiting for them. Stanley helped her into the passenger seat, then climbed in behind the wheel. The engine turned over with a familiar, comforting rumble. Evelyn looked at him, her stormy eyes soft in the morning light. "Where are we going, Stanley?" He looked at her, and for the first time in nearly a decade, a slow, genuine smile touched his lips. It transformed his weary face, chasing away the shadows. "Away," he said, and he put the truck in gear and drove them down the long country road, heading west into the heart of the rising sun. They had nothing but each other and the endless horizon, but for the heartless bootlegger and the secret stowaway, it was more than enough. It was everything. True love is not found in grand gestures, but in the quiet courage to stand for another when the world demands you stand down. It teaches us that even the most hardened heart can be reborn, and that the greatest treasure is not what we carry in our trucks, but who we carry in our souls. A person's true north is not a place on a map, but another person. If this story touched your heart, subscribe for more unforgettable romances.